Before we begin, if you enjoy emotional mafia love stories, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support helps us bring you more unforgettable stories. Now let's begin. The hardest promise I ever kept was the one that made my own daughter believe I had never loved her. The rain tapped softly against the hospital window like nervous fingers, turning the city lights into blurred ribbons of gold. I stood outside the maternity room without moving, my hand still wrapped around the tiny brass key Evelyn had pressed into my palm only minutes earlier. It was old, scratched, ordinary enough that anyone else would have overlooked it. To me, it suddenly weighed more than every building I owned, every decision I had ever made, every mistake I could never erase. Behind the door, my newborn daughter slept peacefully, unaware that the first chapter of her life had already been written by choices she would never understand. Nathan Brooks stopped beside me without saying a word. That was one of the reasons I had trusted him for almost 15 years. He never filled silence simply because it made people uncomfortable. He waited until I looked at him before asking, "What do you need?" I opened my hand and looked at the key one last time. "Take her." He frowned, convinced he had misunderstood me. "Sir, take my daughter. Leave tonight. Raise her as your own." His expression remained calm, but I could see the question forming behind his eyes. Why? He never asked it. Instead, he studied my face with the careful attention of someone searching for permission to argue. I gave him none. "She cannot know who I am," I continued quietly. "She cannot know my name. She cannot know where she came from. If anyone asks, she is your daughter. She always has been." Nathan finally spoke. "And you?" I looked through the small window in the door. The baby yawned in her sleep, one tiny hand curling around nothing at all. I had negotiated impossible deals without hesitation. I had stared down men twice my size without blinking. Yet nothing had prepared me for the sound of my own answer. "I'll become a stranger." The words tasted like broken glass even though my voice never shook. Inside the room, Evelyn rested with her eyes closed, exhaustion softening every line on her face. She looked peaceful for the first time in weeks. She had trusted me with the only thing that mattered to her. Protect our daughter. No matter the cost. Most people think sacrifice feels heroic. They're wrong. It feels quiet. It feels like signing away every birthday, every graduation, every scraped knee you will never bandage, every bedtime story you will never read. Nathan stepped closer. "If I leave tonight, she'll grow up believing someone else is her father." I nodded once. "That's exactly what I want. She may hate you someday. She can't hate someone she never knows." For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. A nurse wheeled an empty bassinet past us with a gentle smile, completely unaware that history had just changed inside that corridor. Nathan reached toward the crib and carefully lifted the sleeping baby into his arms. She never cried. She simply sighed, nestling against the shoulder of the man who would spend the next 24 years protecting a secret that wasn't his to tell. Before he turned away, I placed the small brass key beside the blanket. "Keep this hidden," I whispered. "One day she'll need it." Nathan looked at the key, then back at me. "What does it open?" I closed my fingers around the empty space where it had rested only moments before. "The truth." The first sunrise of her life arrived somewhere along a quiet highway where the city skyline slowly disappeared in the rearview mirror. Nathan Brooks drove with both hands steady on the wheel, while the tiny baby slept peacefully in the carrier beside him, wrapped in a pale cream blanket that still carried the faint scent of the hospital. Every few miles he glanced toward her just to make sure she was still breathing. He had protected important people for most of his adult life, yet nothing had ever made him more nervous than the silence of a sleeping newborn. By late afternoon they reached a small lakeside town where life moved at a slower pace and strangers still waved from front porches. It was the kind of place where nobody asked too many questions if someone showed up hoping to begin again. Martha opened the front door before he reached the porch, her eyes immediately falling on the tiny bundle in his arms. She did not speak for several long seconds. She simply reached forward and carefully touched the baby's little hand. "She is beautiful," she whispered. Nathan nodded, unable to find the right words. "She is ours now." Martha looked into his tired eyes and understood that whatever had happened before this moment was something too heavy to ask about. Instead, she smiled softly and carried the baby inside. Their 12-year-old son Liam looked up from the kitchen table, surprised to see his father home early. "Who is she?" Nathan knelt beside him. "Her name is Autumn." Liam frowned. "Did somebody leave her here?" Nathan forced a gentle smile. "Something like that. Children often accept impossible things more easily than adults." Liam simply nodded before disappearing into his room and returning with his favorite stuffed rabbit. He carefully placed it beside the sleeping baby without saying another word. Years passed more quickly than Nathan expected. Autumn grew into a curious little girl who asked questions about everything. She collected smooth stones from the lake, pressed colorful leaves between old books, and insisted on feeding every stray cat that wandered through the neighborhood. She laughed with her whole heart and cried only when someone else was hurting. Nathan watched every milestone with quiet pride, while carrying a secret that became heavier each year. There were moments when he almost forgot she was not his by blood. Then an envelope would quietly appear in the mailbox every birthday. There was never a return address. Inside was always a simple birthday card with no signature, and enough money to ensure Autumn never had to give up music lessons, school supplies, or dreams because of finances. Nathan never told her where the envelopes came from. He only smiled and said that sometimes kindness arrived without asking for recognition. What Autumn never noticed was the familiar black sedan parked near the town square every year on the afternoon of her birthday. A well-dressed man would step out, stand across the street for only a few minutes, and quietly watch as she laughed with her family outside the local bakery. He never approached. He never waved. When she turned in his direction, he always walked away before their eyes could meet. Nathan noticed every single visit. Neither man ever acknowledged the other. They did not have to. One was honoring a promise. The other was surviving it. And hidden inside an old wooden keepsake box beneath Autumn's childhood drawings rested the tarnished brass key that had remained untouched since the night everything began, waiting patiently for the day the truth could no longer stay locked away. By the time I turned 24, the little lakeside town knew me as the quiet woman who could bring forgotten books back to life. Every morning I unlocked the heavy wooden doors of the historical library before the sun finished climbing above the water. The building smelled of aged paper, cedar shelves, and fresh coffee from the diner across the street. I loved the silence because old books never judged anyone for carrying invisible scars. They simply waited patiently for someone willing to repair what time had damaged. My workbench sat beneath a tall window where soft morning light revealed every torn page and every faded stitch. I believed every broken thing deserved another chance if someone cared enough to mend it carefully. Nathan used to smile whenever I said that. "You have your mother's heart," he would tell me. Whenever I asked which mother he meant, he always answered the same way. "The one who raised you every single day." I never pushed him for more. Some questions felt too personal, even inside a family that loved one another as deeply as ours. Money was never abundant, but somehow we always had enough. The old house needed repairs almost every season. The truck rattled every time Nathan started the engine. Martha clipped grocery coupons with remarkable determination, yet I never missed a school trip, never skipped college because of tuition, and never understood why unexpected blessings always appeared exactly when we needed them. Nathan called them miracles. I called them luck. Looking back now, neither of us knew someone else had quietly been carrying part of that burden all along. On the morning of my birthday, Martha insisted we stop by Harper's Bakery before work. The owner placed a single candle into a small cinnamon cake and refused to accept payment. "Every birthday deserves something sweet," she said with a wink. I laughed as Nathan pretended to complain that I was getting older while he somehow remained exactly the same age. Liam, now finishing graduate school, called just as we walked outside, making everyone laugh with stories about city life and impossible professors. It felt like the kind of ordinary happiness people rarely appreciate until it changes forever. Across the street, a black sedan rested beside the curb. I barely noticed it. Cars came and went every day near the ferry terminal. But inside that sedan sat a man whose eyes never left our little family. Callum Mercer watched me laugh over a paper cup of hot chocolate, while cinnamon sugar dusted the front of my sweater. For one brief second, I brushed the loose strand of hair away from my face exactly the way Evelyn used to. His breathing caught before he slowly looked away, afraid that one more second might tempt him to cross the street and destroy the promise he had protected for almost a quarter of a century. His phone vibrated softly. Only 3 words appeared on the screen. "We found evidence." His expression hardened, not with anger but with quiet concern. Somewhere far beyond the peaceful streets of our little town, someone had begun asking questions that should never have been asked. Callum started the engine without another glance, disappearing before I looked toward the street. That evening, while searching the attic for an empty photo album, I accidentally knocked over an old wooden keepsake box. Family photographs scattered across the dusty floor beside faded birthday cards and childhood drawings. Tucked beneath them rested a tarnished brass key tied with a weathered blue ribbon. I frowned because I had never seen it before. Downstairs, Nathan heard the small sound of the box hitting the floor. The color quietly disappeared from his face as he realized the one secret he had spent 24 years protecting had just begun to unlock itself. The brass key felt colder than it should have. I turned it over in my hand, watching the late afternoon sunlight catch the worn grooves carved by years I could not account for. It was not beautiful. It was not valuable. Yet something about it refused to let me put it back inside the old keepsake box. There was a faded blue ribbon tied through the small hole at the top, its edges softened by time. I knew every object my parents had saved from my childhood, or at least I thought I did. This key had never been there before. "Dad!" I called toward the stairs. My voice echoed through the quiet house. A moment later, Nathan appeared in the attic doorway carrying an empty storage bin. The instant his eyes landed on the key, his expression changed so quickly that most people would have missed it. I did not. His shoulders stiffened. His breathing slowed. Then the familiar smile returned, almost convincing enough to believe. "Where did you find that?" he asked gently. I pointed toward the overturned box. "Under the old pictures. Does it open something?" He climbed the final steps and carefully picked up the scattered photographs instead of answering. They were pictures of scraped knees, birthday cakes, fishing trips, Christmas mornings, and school concerts. My entire life fit inside a weathered wooden box. "It belonged to someone important," he finally said. "Who?" His fingers paused on one photograph before placing it back inside the box. "A friend." I tilted my head. "A friend you never told me about?" He forced a quiet laugh that never reached his eyes. Some stories become easier to carry than to explain. The answer should have satisfied me, but it only made the room feel smaller. Nathan had always answered my questions, even the difficult ones. This time he seemed to be measuring every word before allowing it to leave his mouth. That evening I walked to the library with the key tucked safely inside my coat pocket. Rain clouds drifted across the lake, covering the water with shifting patches of silver and gray. Inside the restoration room I carefully opened an oversized family history ledger that had arrived from a neighboring county. While turning one fragile page after another, something unexpected slipped onto the table. It was an old newspaper clipping someone had accidentally used as a bookmark decades earlier. The article described a charity gala held 25 years ago. A photograph accompanied the story. Wealthy donors smiled politely toward the camera. Standing slightly behind them was a younger man in a perfectly tailored dark suit. His face seemed strangely familiar even though I was certain we had never met. I stared at the photograph longer than I intended before quietly folding the clipping and placing it beside the brass key. Across the state, Callum Mercer stood alone inside the window of his office as evening settled over the city. He no longer watched skylines because they impressed him. He watched them because distance had become the safest way to love someone he could never claim. His assistant entered without speaking and placed a single folder on the desk. "The inquiries are becoming more frequent," she said softly. "Someone is searching for records connected to 24 years ago." Callum rested one hand against the edge of the desk and closed his eyes for only a second. "Increase protection around the town," he replied. Quietly. "No one must know she is the reason. And if she begins asking questions herself?" He looked toward the fading light beyond the glass. "Then the truth is already moving faster than we are." Back at home, I emptied my coat pocket before going to bed. The brass key landed beside the folded newspaper clipping on my nightstand. For reasons I could not explain, I placed them together instead of apart, unaware that the two forgotten pieces of the past had just become the first clues leading toward the same impossible story. The next morning the brass key was still sitting beside the folded newspaper clipping exactly where I had left it, yet somehow the entire room felt different. It was strange how a single unanswered question could quietly rearrange an ordinary life. I slipped both items into my canvas satchel before heading to the library, telling myself I was simply curious. Curiosity sounded harmless. It certainly felt safer than admitting that something deep inside me had begun whispering that my family was protecting a truth too heavy for words. The library was unusually busy that afternoon. A local history society had donated several boxes of records rescued from an abandoned courthouse, and I spent hours carefully cleaning brittle documents one page at a time. Dust floated through the warm beams of sunlight while the steady ticking of the old wall clock filled the silence. Near the bottom of one box I discovered a collection of property records tied together with faded blue string. Tucked between two folders rested another newspaper clipping from nearly 25 years earlier. The photograph showed the same man I had noticed the night before, only this time his name appeared beneath the image. Callum Mercer. The article described him as a private businessman known for funding hospitals, community centers, and scholarship programs, while avoiding publicity whenever possible. I studied his face again. There was something unexpectedly familiar about his eyes, although I could not explain why. Before I could think any longer, my coworker Rosa called from across the room. "Autumn, someone is asking for you." I walked toward the front desk expecting to see a delivery driver or one of our regular patrons. Instead, I found a neatly dressed woman in her early 50s waiting patiently beside the entrance. She carried herself with effortless confidence, yet her smile felt warm rather than intimidating. "Miss Hale," she asked. "My name is Grace Whitmore. I represent a charitable foundation that supports historical preservation." She admired several of the restored books displayed in the reading room before explaining that the foundation wished to sponsor restoration projects in small community libraries. Everything she said sounded perfectly reasonable, yet I noticed something unusual. Every few moments her attention drifted toward me instead of the books. It was almost as though she had come to inspect a person rather than a building. After she left, Rosa leaned closer with a grin. She barely asked about the collection. She asked about you. I laughed it away, but the comment lingered in my thoughts long after closing time. Several hundred miles away, Callum Mercer stood inside a quiet conference room listening as Grace delivered her report. "She is kind," Grace said softly. "She treats everyone with respect. She has your patience." Callum lowered his eyes for a moment. "Does she seem happy?" Grace smiled. "Very. She believes she has lived an ordinary life." Relief crossed his face, but it lasted only a heartbeat. Another advisor entered carrying a sealed envelope marked confidential. Callum opened it slowly. Inside was a copy of an archived birth record that should have disappeared decades earlier. Across the top someone had written 3 words in dark ink. "We know enough." The room fell silent. Callum carefully folded the paper before looking toward Nathan's town on the map hanging beside the window. "The time we borrowed is almost gone," he whispered. That evening I returned home to find Nathan sitting alone on the back porch watching the lake as the last light faded beyond the trees. He rarely sat still for long, yet tonight he had not even noticed my footsteps. I reached into my bag, placed the brass key and the newspaper clipping gently on the table between us, and asked the question that neither of us could avoid any longer. "Dad, who is Callum Mercer?" The question hung between us like the evening mist drifting across the lake. Nathan did not answer right away. He simply looked at the brass key, then at the faded newspaper clipping, before letting out a slow breath that sounded far older than the man sitting in front of me. The porch light flickered on as daylight disappeared, wrapping everything in a warm amber glow that somehow made the silence feel even heavier. Finally he reached for the clipping, running his thumb across the printed photograph as though he had done it 1,000 times before. "Callum Mercer is a man who has spent most of his life trying to protect something precious," he said quietly. I frowned. "That is not really an answer." He smiled sadly. "No. It is the only one I can give you tonight." I leaned back in my chair, frustrated by how carefully he measured every word. Nathan had never lied to me, But for the first time I realized that telling only part of the truth could feel almost the same. Martha stepped onto the porch carrying 3 mugs of hot tea. One look at our faces told her everything she needed to know. She quietly placed the mugs on the table before resting a gentle hand on Nathan's shoulder. "You knew this day would come," she whispered. He nodded without looking up. "I only hoped it would come later." I looked from one to the other. "What day?" Neither of them answered. That night sleep refused to find me. The brass key rested on my nightstand beside the newspaper clipping, catching the pale moonlight every time I opened my eyes. By sunrise I had made a decision. If no one could explain why Callum Mercer mattered, perhaps I could ask the man himself. Back at the library I searched public records, newspaper archives, and charitable foundation reports. Most articles described him the same way: private, reserved, generous, rarely photographed, almost impossible to interview. One notice caught my attention. The Mercer Historical Foundation would be unveiling a restored maritime museum, only 40 miles away the following afternoon. Admission was open to the public. My heart beat a little faster than it should have. I told myself I was only satisfying my curiosity. Deep down I knew it had already become something more. The next afternoon the museum overlooked the harbor where old fishing boats rocked gently against the docks. Families wandered through exhibits while volunteers welcomed visitors with warm smiles. I stood quietly studying a display of antique navigation instruments when a small boy accidentally dropped a stack of brochures near my feet. I bent down to help him gather the scattered papers just as another pair of hands reached for the last one. "Thank you," a calm voice said. I looked up. The man from the newspaper stood only a few feet away. His dark suit was simple, his silver-threaded hair neatly combed, yet nothing about him felt ordinary. His eyes met mine for only a moment before something changed in his expression. Surprise. Relief. Heartbreak. All of it appeared and disappeared so quickly that I wondered if I had imagined it. "You should keep that brochure," he said gently. "The final exhibit is worth seeing." His voice carried a quiet warmth that felt strangely familiar despite the fact that we had never met. Before I could respond, one of the museum coordinators called his name from across the room. "Mr. Mercer, the guests are ready." He offered me a polite nod and turned away, but after only 3 steps he paused. Without looking back he said softly, "Take good care of the people who raised you. They are extraordinary." Then he continued toward the ceremony, leaving me standing perfectly still as a chill traveled down my spine. I had never told him my name. I had certainly never told him anything about my family. Yet somehow Callum Mercer already knew exactly who I was. The drive home felt longer than 40 miles. Every mile marker seemed to ask the same question that refused to leave my mind. How did Callum Mercer know the people who raised me? The late afternoon sun stretched across the highway, painting the lake with ribbons of gold. But for the first time in years I barely noticed the view. My fingers tightened around the steering wheel while his final words echoed over and over inside my head. "Take good care of the people who raised you. They are extraordinary." Those were not the words of a stranger making polite conversation. They were the words of someone who had been watching from a distance for a very long time. When I pulled into our driveway, Nathan was already outside repairing the loose railing on the front porch. He looked up the moment my car stopped. One glance at my face told him something had changed. I climbed out without speaking. The brass key rested inside my coat pocket, heavier than ever. "I met him," I finally said. Nathan slowly lowered the screwdriver onto the porch step. "Who?" I held his eyes. "Callum Mercer." The color faded from his face. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But I had known this man my entire life. I noticed everything. "What did he say?" he asked quietly. "He told me to take good care of the people who raised me." Nathan closed his eyes for a brief moment before looking toward the lake. "Then he has not changed." My heartbeat quickened. "You know him." He nodded once. There was no point denying it anymore. Martha stepped outside carrying a basket of fresh laundry, then stopped when she saw the silence hanging between us. She quietly set the basket down and joined us without asking questions. Nathan rested both hands on the porch railing, staring at the water beyond the trees. "Autumn," he began softly. "There are promises that protect people, and there are promises that imprison them. I have carried one for 24 years. I waited, hardly breathing. Callum Mercer trusted me with the most important responsibility of my life. My voice trembled. Why? Nathan looked at me with eyes filled with love and regret. Because he believed I could give a little girl something he never could. An ordinary childhood. The words settled over me like falling snow. They explained almost nothing, yet somehow they explained everything. Every mysterious birthday card. Every unexpected blessing. Every strange silence whenever I asked about my past. Was he a friend? I whispered. Nathan hesitated. Yes. Only a friend? His shoulders sank. No. Before he could continue, his phone vibrated inside his jacket. He almost ignored it until he noticed the number. I had never seen him react to a phone call that way. He answered with only 2 words. I understand. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. When he slipped the phone back into his pocket, he suddenly looked 10 years older. Martha reached for his hand without speaking. What happened? I asked. Nathan forced a small smile that could not hide the worry in his eyes. Someone has started opening old records that should have remained forgotten. Does that have anything to do with me? He met my gaze. This time he did not look away. Everything has to do with you. My breath caught. The evening breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh water across the porch as Nathan disappeared inside the house. A minute later he returned holding a weathered leather journal I had never seen before. He placed it gently on the table beside the brass key. The cover was worn smooth with age and, pressed into the faded leather were 2 small initials. E.H. Nathan rested his hand on the journal but did not release it. This belonged to a woman named Evelyn Hale, he said quietly. If you open this book, your life will never be the same again. I stared at the worn leather journal for what felt like an hour before I finally reached for it. The cover was soft from years of careful hands, and the initials pressed into the faded brown leather seemed almost alive beneath my fingertips. Nathan never tried to stop me. He simply sat beside Martha on the porch, both of them watching the lake in complete silence. It felt as though they had already lived this moment 1,000 times inside their minds. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the first page. The handwriting was elegant, careful, and unmistakably personal. If my daughter ever reads these pages, it means the promise that protected her has finally reached its end. I stopped breathing. My daughter. I looked up at Nathan. He nodded slowly, giving me permission to continue. The next sentence blurred as tears unexpectedly filled my eyes. Her name is Autumn. If you are reading this, I hope you grew up surrounded by ordinary mornings, birthday candles, school concerts, scraped knees, family dinners, and people who loved you without asking for anything in return. I closed my eyes for a moment. Every memory rushed back at once. Nathan teaching me to ride a bicycle beside the lake. Martha waiting with hot chocolate after every winter walk. Liam cheering louder than anyone when I graduated. Nothing about my childhood had been extraordinary. It had simply been full of love. When I looked down again, another folded piece of paper slipped from between the pages and landed softly in my lap. Nathan immediately recognized it. I have never opened that letter, he said quietly. It was never meant for me. I unfolded the yellowed paper with shaking fingers. The ink had faded slightly, but every word remained perfectly readable. Autumn, if life has brought this letter to you, then I am no longer here to answer your questions. Please do not blame the man who raised you. Every choice he made came from love. I swallowed hard before reading the next line. There is another man carrying a burden that was never supposed to become his entire life. His greatest act of love will look like abandonment until someone finally tells you the truth. A tear rolled silently onto the paper. I did not know why those words hurt so much. I had always believed families were built by daily acts of kindness rather than shared blood. Yet something inside me had begun shifting, as though pieces of a puzzle were quietly finding one another after years apart. Nathan stood and walked to the edge of the porch, giving me space. She wrote that during the final days before you were born, he said without turning around. She asked me to keep it safe until you were ready. Why did she trust you? I whispered. Nathan smiled sadly toward the water. Because someone else asked me to protect the 2 people he loved most. Before I could ask another question, The sound of tires crunching over gravel echoed from the driveway. An unfamiliar delivery vehicle came to a gentle stop beside the mailbox. The driver stepped out carrying a small package with no return address. He handed it to me with a polite smile before driving away. Inside was a simple velvet box. Resting on white fabric was an antique compass engraved with tiny initials that matched the journal. Beneath it lay a handwritten note containing only one sentence. The brass key belongs with the compass. Together they reveal what neither one can reveal alone. I looked toward Nathan in confusion, but before he could speak, his phone rang once again. He answered, listened in complete silence, then slowly lowered the phone. His face had lost every trace of color. "He is coming here himself," Nathan whispered. "After 24 years, Callum has finally decided it is time to stop hiding." The house felt unusually quiet after Nathan's phone call, as though even the old wooden walls were waiting for someone they had not seen in decades. I placed the brass key beside the antique compass on the dining room table and studied them together. At first they looked like two unrelated heirlooms, each carrying its own forgotten history. Then I noticed something almost invisible. A tiny engraved symbol appeared on both pieces. A simple compass rose hidden inside the metalwork. When I carefully turned the brass key over, one point of the engraved star aligned perfectly with a matching mark on the compass lid. A faint click echoed through the room. Martha covered her mouth in surprise. The top of the compass slowly lifted another fraction of an inch, revealing a narrow compartment hidden beneath the needle. Inside rested a folded photograph that had been protected from time for almost 25 years. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. A young woman with kind eyes smiled into the camera, while holding a newborn wrapped in a pale blanket. Standing beside her was Callum Mercer, looking younger but unmistakably the same man I had met at the museum. His expression was nothing like the reserved businessman described in newspaper articles. He was smiling with the quiet wonder of someone seeing the entire world inside a tiny pair of sleeping eyes. Written across the bottom of the photograph in elegant handwriting were 5 simple words. "Our first morning together forever." My breath caught. I had never seen that woman before, yet something about her smile felt painfully familiar. Martha gently touched the corner of the picture. "That is Evelyn," she whispered. "She loved you before you ever opened your eyes." I looked toward Nathan, searching for the answer he had been carrying all these years. He nodded slowly. "Yes. She was your mother." The words settled into the room with astonishing gentleness. I had imagined this moment many different ways over the years without realizing it. I thought I might feel anger, confusion, or disbelief. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sadness for a woman whose handwriting had become the closest thing I would ever have to hearing her voice. Nathan reached into the hidden compartment one more time and removed a second folded paper. Unlike Evelyn's letter, this one contained only a single page written in bold, careful handwriting. I recognized the signature immediately before I even finished reading. If these items have reached Autumn, then she has already begun asking questions. "Nathan, thank you for giving her the ordinary childhood I could never provide. No amount of gratitude will ever equal what you sacrifice for us. When the day comes that she learns my name, do not ask her to forgive me. Let that choice belong entirely to her." I lowered the page slowly, unable to stop the tears gathering in my eyes. Outside, the familiar sound of gravel shifting beneath approaching tires drifted through the open kitchen window. Nathan stood first, his expression calm but heavy. Martha quietly squeezed my hand before joining him on the front porch. I remained frozen beside the table, still holding the photograph. Through the window I watched a dark sedan roll gently into the driveway before coming to a complete stop beneath the old maple tree. The driver's door opened. Callum Mercer stepped out alone, carrying no briefcase, no phone, and no expression of authority. For the first time since I had unknowingly crossed paths with him, he looked less like a powerful man and more like someone who had spent 24 years rehearsing a conversation he prayed would never become necessary. He paused beside the front gate, looked toward the porch where Nathan stood waiting, then slowly lifted his eyes until they met mine through the window. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Somehow, in that single silent moment, it felt as though both of our lives had finally reached the place where the truth could no longer remain hidden. For several long seconds no one moved. The only sound came from the wind stirring the maple leaves above the driveway, and the distant cry of a gull drifting across the lake. Callum Mercer closed the car door quietly behind him, as though he feared even the smallest noise might shatter the fragile moment standing between us. He looked older than he had at the museum only days before. Not weaker. Simply tired in a way that no amount of sleep could ever repair. Nathan stepped down from the porch first. The two men stood facing one another only a few feet apart. Neither reached out for a handshake. Neither needed to. Their eyes carried 24 years of shared silence. "You came alone," Nathan said softly. Callum nodded once. "She deserves honesty, not an audience." Nathan studied him for a moment before stepping aside. "Then come in." My heartbeat grew louder with every step Callum took toward the front door. I remained standing beside the dining table where the photograph, the compass, and the brass key still rested exactly as I had left them. He stopped several feet away, careful not to invade the space that still belonged to strangers. His eyes drifted toward the photograph first. A faint smile appeared before disappearing almost immediately. "I have not seen that picture in 24 years, he whispered. "Evelyn insisted someone take it before sunrise." I swallowed hard. "She wrote letters." His expression softened. "She always believed words could survive when people could not." I looked down at the photograph again. "She called me Autumn. She chose your name before anyone else knew you were coming." The room fell silent once more. Martha quietly excused herself to the kitchen, giving us privacy without making the moment feel forced. Nathan remained nearby, not because he doubted either of us, but because this conversation belonged to all three of us in different ways. I finally looked directly at the man standing across from me. "Did you know where I was all these years?" He answered without hesitation. "Every birthday, every graduation, every milestone Nathan allowed me to celebrate from a distance." My chest tightened. "So you watched. Only enough to know you were safe. Why did you never come closer?" He lowered his eyes briefly before answering. "Because every time I wanted to, I remembered the promise that kept you alive." I searched his face for signs of deception and found only quiet grief. "Nathan told me you asked him to raise me." "Yes." "Why him?" Callum glanced toward Nathan with unmistakable respect. "Because I trusted him more than I trusted myself." Nathan looked away, clearly uncomfortable hearing those words spoken aloud after so many years. I stepped closer to the table and picked up the brass key. "This belonged to my mother?" "It belonged to both of us," Callum replied. "We bought an old lighthouse on the coast before you were born. We planned to restore it together. That key opened the front door." I frowned. "Then why hide it inside the compass?" A sad smile crossed his face. "Because the lighthouse no longer mattered. What mattered was making sure one day you would discover that every piece of your past still pointed toward the truth." Before I could ask another question, a cell phone resting inside Callum's jacket began vibrating. He glanced at the screen but did not answer immediately. For the first time since arriving, genuine concern crossed his face. He silenced the call, but a second message appeared almost instantly. Nathan noticed the change in his expression. "What is it?" Callum slowly slipped the phone back into his pocket. "Someone else knows I came here." I felt the room grow colder even though the evening air remained warm. Callum looked directly at me. His voice calm despite the worry in his eyes. "Autumn, there is something I should have told you years ago. The greatest danger was never that you would learn who I am. It was that someone else would learn who you are first." The room remained silent long after Callum spoke those words. I looked from him to Nathan, hoping one of them would tell me this was all some elaborate misunderstanding. Neither did. Instead, Callum slowly removed his phone from his pocket and placed it face down on the dining table beside the brass key and the compass. "For 24 years, he said quietly, "every decision I made was meant to keep one promise. Not to build an empire. Not to protect my reputation. Only to make sure you had the chance to grow up without carrying the weight of my world." I folded my arms tightly across my chest. "Then tell me the truth. All of it. No more pieces." He nodded. "You deserve nothing less." He took a slow breath before looking toward the photograph of Evelyn. "The night before you were born, Evelyn made me promise something I believed I could keep. She said that if our daughter ever had to choose between a safe childhood and growing up beside us, I was never allowed to choose myself. His voice became quieter. I argued with her for hours. I told her families belonged together. She smiled and said families belonged wherever love could protect them best. My eyes drifted toward the journal lying beside the photograph. Every page suddenly carried even greater meaning. She already knew, I whispered. Callum nodded. She understood that our lives would never be ordinary. She wanted yours to be. Nathan stood near the window saying nothing. His silence was not empty. It was the silence of someone remembering a promise made decades earlier. Callum continued. When you were born, Evelyn placed that brass key in my hand. She said one day it would help you find your way back to the truth, but only after you had first learned who you were without it. I slowly sat down, trying to absorb words that seemed to rewrite my entire life. Then what happened to her? His eyes filled with unmistakable sadness. She became very ill shortly after you were born. During those final days, she never worried about herself. She worried only about you. He looked toward Nathan. She asked me one question I could never forget. She asked whether I loved our daughter enough to let someone else become her father if that gave her a better life. Tears blurred my vision. And you said yes. I did, he answered softly. It was the hardest word I have ever spoken. Nathan finally stepped closer. You should know something, Autumn. I looked at him. Your father never disappeared from your life. He disappeared from your memories before they even had a chance to exist. He smiled sadly. Every birthday card came from him. Every anonymous scholarship payment. Every time the roof leaked and somehow there was enough money to repair it. Every music lesson. Every college bill. Every unexpected blessing you called luck. I covered my mouth as the truth settled over years of ordinary moments I had never questioned. Why did you never tell me? I asked Nathan. His eyes glistened. Because I promised both of your parents that you would grow up believing you were loved, not protected by fear. Before anyone spoke again, Callum's phone lit up once more. This time he picked it up. He listened quietly for only a few seconds before ending the call. His expression did not change, but I noticed his hand tighten slightly around the phone. Nathan recognized the look immediately. It is happening, isn't it? Callum nodded once. The archived records are no longer sealed. I frowned. What records? He looked directly into my eyes, his voice steady and calm. The official birth certificate has been found. By tomorrow morning, anyone searching for Evelyn Hale's daughter will know exactly where to begin. Morning arrived quietly, but nothing about the house felt ordinary anymore. The familiar sound of birds outside the kitchen window and the smell of fresh coffee could not erase the truth that had settled into every corner of our home the night before. I sat alone at the dining table, turning Evelyn's journal one page at a time. Her words no longer felt like the memories of a stranger. They felt like conversations I had waited my entire life to hear. Martha placed a warm plate of pancakes in front of me exactly the way she had every birthday since I was 5 years old. She smiled gently before brushing a loose strand of hair behind my ear. No matter what you learn, she whispered, nothing changes the mornings we shared. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. I reached across the table and held her hand. You are my mother. She smiled through her own tears. That is all I ever hoped to be. A few minutes later, Nathan stepped onto the porch where Callum had spent most of the morning quietly watching the lake. Neither man spoke immediately. They stood shoulder to shoulder in comfortable silence, looking out across the calm water that had witnessed so much of my childhood. Finally, Nathan broke the silence. I always wondered whether she would look more like you or Evelyn. Callum smiled faintly. She became herself. Nathan nodded with quiet pride. She did. I watched them through the window and realized something that had never crossed my mind before. These two men had never been rivals. One had given me life. The other had given me a childhood. Neither had taken anything from the other. They had spent 24 years carrying different pieces of the same promise. Later that afternoon, I walked outside holding the photograph from the hidden compartment inside the compass. I stopped beside Callum and handed it to him. His fingers lingered carefully along the edge of the picture before he looked at Evelyn's smiling face once again. "She would have been proud of you," he said softly. I looked toward the lake. "I wish I could remember her." "You do," he answered. I turned back in confusion. "How?" He pointed toward the journal. "Every time you restore a damaged book instead of replacing it. Every time you help someone without expecting recognition. Every time you choose kindness over pride." Those were all Evelyn. The words settled gently into my heart. For the first time since this journey began, I stopped asking which parts of me belonged to whom. Perhaps love had never divided itself that way. As the afternoon faded into evening, Liam arrived unexpectedly after driving straight from the city. The moment he stepped out of his car, he wrapped me in the same ridiculous bear hug he had given me since childhood. "You are still my annoying little sister," he declared with a grin. Everyone laughed, even Callum. It was the first genuine laugh I had heard from him. The sound carried years of relief hidden beneath it. Just before sunset, Callum walked toward his car. "I should leave," he said quietly. "You have already lost enough peace because of me." I surprised myself by reaching out before he could open the driver's door. "You do not have to disappear again." He froze. Slowly he turned back toward me. I took a careful breath before speaking the words that seemed impossible only yesterday. "Nathan will always be my dad." He nodded silently. I smiled through tears that no longer felt heavy. "But I think I have room in my heart to know my father too." Callum closed his eyes for only a moment, unable to hide the emotion that crossed his face. Before either of us could say another word, a county sheriff's vehicle rolled slowly into the driveway. The deputy stepped out carrying a sealed envelope and asked politely, "Does Autumn Hale live here? I have official documents that require her signature." The deputy removed a large envelope from his leather case and handed it to me with a polite smile that revealed nothing. "Miss Autumn Hale?" he asked. I nodded. "Please, sign here." These documents were released by court order after a long-standing legal restriction expired. My hands trembled as I signed the receipt. After thanking us, the deputy returned to his vehicle and slowly drove away, leaving behind only tire tracks on the gravel and another unanswered question. We gathered around the dining table once more. Nathan stood beside Martha, while Callum remained quietly near the window, almost as though he still believed he needed permission to be inside the home where his daughter had grown up. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside rested several official documents, including my original birth certificate, Evelyn's final letter of instruction, and one sealed envelope addressed simply to Autumn. The handwriting was immediately familiar. I broke the seal with careful fingers. "My dearest Autumn, if this letter has finally reached you, then every promise we made has done exactly what it was meant to do. You lived long enough to become your own person before learning where you came from. Never measure your life by blood alone. Measure it by kindness freely given, sacrifices quietly carried, and people who chose to love you every ordinary day. Nathan gave you the childhood your father and I dreamed about. Your father gave you the future we prayed you would have. Neither man failed you. They loved you differently because love sometimes wears different faces." I stopped reading for a moment, wiping away tears that blurred the ink. The room was completely silent. Even the old clock on the wall seemed to pause. I continued, "If there ever comes a day when you stand between them, do not choose one heart over the other. A daughter does not become smaller because she is loved by two fathers. She becomes stronger." By the time I reached the final sentence, I could barely speak aloud. Live with courage, forgive before regret arrives, and whenever you unlock an old door, remember that home is never the place where your story began. Home is the place where love waited for you to return. I slowly folded the letter and looked across the room. Nathan's eyes were filled with tears he no longer tried to hide. Martha quietly leaned against his shoulder. Callum stood perfectly still, his gaze lowered toward the floor as though he believed he had no right to expect anything after 24 years of silence. I walked toward Nathan first. Without saying a word, I wrapped my arms around the man who had taught me to ride a bicycle, helped me with homework, waited outside every school performance, and loved me through every ordinary day of my life. "Thank you, Dad," I whispered. His shoulders shook gently as he embraced me. When I stepped back, I turned toward Callum. For a brief moment, neither of us knew what to say. Then I remembered the frightened young father smiling in the faded photograph, the anonymous birthday cards, the scholarships, the quiet sacrifices, and every mile he had traveled simply to watch me laugh from across the street. I stepped forward and embraced him too. He hesitated for only a heartbeat before carefully returning the hug, as though afraid I might disappear if he held on too tightly. "Welcome home," I said softly. His breath caught, and after 24 years of carrying the heaviest promise of his life, he finally allowed himself to whisper the two words he had waited an entire lifetime to say. "My daughter." That evening we walked together to the lakeshore where the water reflected the colors of the setting sun. I slipped the brass key into my pocket, placed the antique compass beside Evelyn's journal, and realized none of those objects were meant to unlock a building or a secret. They had always been meant to unlock forgiveness. Some people inherit fortunes. Some inherit names. I inherited something far more valuable. I inherited the proof that real love is never measured by who stays closest. Sometimes it is measured by who quietly sacrifices everything so that someone else can grow up believing the world is still full of ordinary miracles. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Callum's place? See you in the next story.